did last night have, it's weird how it worked out. It was like one of the three game teams all came last night because they all wanted to come on Tuesday. And then we've got the other two game teams here tonight. So it actually worked out kind of well along those lines. So what I want to do first is start by just kind of checking of where we are, what's happening tonight, and essentially what's happening over the next couple of weeks to set ourselves up for the central spring break week, which is in 2 weeks. So we've got no classes in 2 weeks because that is spring break, at least for Central. In terms of taking a little bit of a look backwards, the Powtoon projects are technically due today. So I haven't looked at anything unless people asked me to look at something specific in terms of feedback. I will assume after today that they are ready to be looked at unless you send me some sort of a message saying I'm not quite ready yet, I need a little extra time. And that's fine. Just let me know because I will, otherwise if I see that the ID plan is uploaded and I've got the link to the Powtoon, I'm gonna start going through those. And my hope is that certainly by the time we come back from Central Spring Break, that I will have all of those gone through and assessed and all of that. So you'll be getting feedback on those within the next couple of weeks. So just let me know if you need a little more time, and that's totally fine with me. So that project is wrapping up. The next project, obviously in this class, is we're definitely shifting into the full game project mode. Tonight we are going to be taking a look essentially at the design phase of the game. Hopefully your groups have had a chance at this point to have conversations about mainly the topic of your game, what's the basic direction you're looking to go in. So tonight we're going to start looking at some design questions, some things that you just want to kind of figure out about your game as you're starting to structure it. And we're going to be looking at the process of flow charting a game tonight, which is going to be one of the most helpful tools as you're developing the system of rules for your game to make sure that the rules you're creating are specific enough that they're not going to create situations in the game where people don't know what they're supposed to do next. So that's going to be the main thing tonight. It's going to be an arts and crafts night. I've got colored pens and Post-its and big pieces of paper. So especially for all of you sort of more analog people who like to move things around on a piece of paper, tonight is your night. So we're going to be splitting up into a couple of groups and taking a look at an existing game and trying to reverse engineer it into a flowchart kind of structure just to get a sense of what that looks like, because that is something you're going to definitely want to do with your game projects is to develop that flowchart structure so that you know you've accounted for everything in your rules. So that is tonight, is mainly focusing on the design piece. So over the course of the next week, you in your groups will be mainly focused on the first two parts of the instructional design for your game. So the analysis piece, which you've probably, hopefully, taken care of a fair amount of at this point just in your initial discussions. You know, who are you making the game for? What's the main topic of the game? That sort of a thing. And then the second piece, the D of the ADDIE, which is the design, which coming out of tonight, you'll have a clearer idea of the design questions. So over the course of the next week, you'll be trying to fill in those two pieces of the ID plan. And then next week is what I call alpha testing week. It's not really even testing, but I call it alpha testing instead of beta testing because the expectation next week is not that any part of your game is playable, but that you will at least be far enough along where you can sit down and explain to someone else the general direction the game is going in, what kind of a game it's going to be, and get feedback from some outside people in terms of sort of where your game is. So before you get too far into the nitty-gritty of actually creating pieces and flowcharting rules and all that, I think it's helpful to get a point where you can just get some outside feedback from some people who don't know what you've been working on and are hearing it for the first time. I know out of the projects last year, we had at least one of the three that actually underwent a pretty significant change because of that alpha testing phase. They got some really good suggestions from other people in the class And as a result of that, some light bulbs went on, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we should," And then the game kind of went a slightly different direction. So next week is alpha testing. So the idea is going to be to share your idea of the game with people from the other groups and get some feedback from them. So we're going to be doing this little sort of round robin things. And then that sets us up for the spring break week. So then at that point, you'll have 2 uninterrupted weeks to really start hammering out some of the details of the game and starting to work the nitty gritty and figure out what the game's actually going to look like and how it's going to actually play and so on. But you should come away from next week's class with a pretty good sense that you've got a clear direction for the game. So that is sort of looking backward, looking at today, looking forward. Mixed into that, and this is not related to the 520 class, but the 530 class, is that on the original syllabus, 530, so this doesn't apply, the 2 of you can just ignore the next 3 minutes, is next week was one of the couple of weeks in the course where we were going to meet on campus, and that in a weird sort of a way mirrors what we're going to be doing with the games, and that it's sort of an alpha testing week for the Moodles, where you'll be doing a similar thing of the Moodle is not expected to be done or even necessarily completely usable, but to have people sit down and just kind of take a look at what you've done, get some explanation from you about the direction you're headed in, and also get some feedback on it. So my thinking is this, in the interest of trying to make your lives simpler, is rather than asking you, all of you that are in both classes, to come to campus Tuesday night and Wednesday night, is to sort of melt the 2 together so that we only have to come up to campus on one night. And so my thought was, since the majority of you are already coming to campus on Wednesday nights, is to do that next Wednesday. And my idea would be to extend Wednesday's class a little bit. We're not going to double it. We're not going to need twice the amount of time to do this. But to start off next Wednesday's class with 520, so with everybody in the gaming class, and then when we are finished with those activities, the alpha testing of the games and so on, is then wave goodbye to the 2 of you, and then roll right into doing the alpha testing of the Moodles. And the thought would be that we could be done by 8 o'clock at the latest. So maybe looking at extending that night by an hour, but by doing that, we eliminate having to come to campus 2 nights in a row. So thoughts on that? Does that sound doable, manageable? I'm trying to kind of split the difference between, I know Wednesday nights are tough nights to be out late, but I figure if we can at least get done by 8, that's still. So for you, we can have a discussion individually, but we can make it work either way. Obviously your other teammates are here for the gaming portion. If you wanted to be here on campus for the Moodle testing, so you can actually talk to people, that would be starting a little later.
So yeah, I was thinking the Wednesday class starts at 5, right?
Yeah.
So if I left work at 5, if I got lucky and left earlier, I could be here by 6. And would there still be some of the?
Yeah, probably around 6 or so. 6:30 is when we would be transitioning from the 520 gaming stuff, and then transitioning into the 530 Moodle stuff.
Okay.
So if you wanted to, I know, I asked you to come this week if possible. I want you to, feel like it's comfortable for you too.
Yeah, certainly later is
okay.
Later, fine. But if I want to try to get there for some of the gaming, I'll try to work that out.
Yeah, we'll just leave that up to you. We could certainly alpha test your Moodle without you here by just bringing it up and having people look at it. But obviously, if you're here to have the one-on-one conversations, that's always a little more.
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll be the plan. That essentially there will be no Tuesday class at all, either online or not, and that we will mush together both the 5:30 and the 5:20 class on Wednesday, starting with the 5. I always get these backwards. Starting with the 5:20 with the gaming, and spending an hour and a half, something like that, discussing the games, getting feedback, and then transitioning at that point into the 5:30 and doing some alpha testing and presentations of the Moodles, and with the hope to be wrapped up by 8 o'clock at the latest, and then you're off for 2 weeks after that.
Speaking of the other class, so next week, have, just like you said, have your Moodles at least ready to kind of show something. But on the syllabus, it says the Moodle ID is due. Isn't it technically already due, or is it just like a more finalized version?
Yeah, that's a case where sort of it's ignore what's on the original syllabus in some way. I mean, my at this point, your Moodle IDs should be relatively complete. I mean, we've gone through all of the questions that are there. Now, people's Moodles are still evolving, and some people are still making some shifts in things, so there might be adjustments being made back and forth. That was more just a target that if you're going to be talking to people about your Moodle, that the idea is that your planning phase should pretty much be done at that point, so that you have something to talk about. Even if what's in the Moodle itself is not complete and it's still just a framework and bits and pieces here and there, at least you've got that plan more or less in mind, so that you can then talk to somebody and say, well, this is going to have this in it, and here's the direction I'm going. So it's not so much that I'm going to like do an assessment of the IDs after next week. It's more that we want to get to that point by next week, since that's when you're going to be presenting your Moodles for the first time.
As far as them being due, just that putting them at the top of the Moodle was all that's required.
Right. And that way, if you need to make adjustments, if there's still things that are changing, you can always update it and then just upload the new copy. Yeah, in the end, when the Moodle is done, that is the way that I will look at your IDs, is by going onto your Moodle and clicking on whatever the state of the document is at that time. And that'll be what I'm looking for.
Change things in the actual Moodle, we should also update the ID plan.
Yeah, if anything you're doing in the Moodle would make adjustments to the ID plan, just keep updating it. It should be a living document until the project is done. So, all right, so that's a lot of looking backwards and forwards and everything for both of the classes, but I think that puts us in a good place to get to that spring break week with both classes, with two of the major projects kind of knowing what you've got to do, and you've got a good couple of weeks without anything else to worry about than just working on those two projects. All right, so tonight is mainly about, as I said, game design. Looking at a couple of issues. We are going to mainly look at this idea of flowcharting a game and so on, and then obviously I'll talk about what we need to do over the course of the next week or so. So let's just jump right into it. I wanted to pick a game for us to look at that hopefully everyone knows, although I realize that games come and go and sometimes people think a game is everybody knows this and don't. We discovered last night that of the three people, at least one of them had not played this game for decades, so it took a little brushing up. But we're gonna use the game of Uno as our kind of test tonight. It is a very popular card game. It's been around for a long time. I think it's popular because even very young children can play it pretty easily. I know my daughter was a monster at it when she was only like 5 or 6. She could consistently beat the pants off of us. And that was not, I don't know, those of you that have kids, that urge to like let your kids win when they're very young and you're playing games with them. And I learned very early on, I don't need to do that when we're playing Uno, because she got it. She knew how to play that game. But we're going to use that as our test subject for tonight. I know it's not an instructional game, but I think it's a game that is relatively straightforward in terms of its rules and so on. So what we're going to start off with, here's what I need to do, is by looking at, this is essentially the same questions, the same things you're going to need to be answering in your ID plan for your game. So we're going to go through these. Some of this is new stuff, so we're going to talk a little bit about what informational style is. Some of it comes directly out of the definition for game that we've been working with for the last couple of weeks. So here is that definition. System of rules. Agents are competing, making meaningful, ambiguous decisions to reach a defined end game. So in the design phase, one of the very first questions you're going to want to answer with your group is simply the delivery mode of the game. This is essentially the type of game it is. Is it a board game? Is it a dice game? Is it a card game? Is it a role-playing game? Is it a video game? I don't think any groups are probably going to do a video game, but that's always possible. So obviously, when you've done your analysis and you know what audience you're working with, certain types of games are going to work better with different age groups. It might be hard for younger hands to hold a hand of cards, believe it or not. That can be one of the tougher things to deal with. Board games can be very visual, but then you get a lot of game pieces and you have to keep track of the game pieces. So as you're starting to develop your idea for your game, that's obviously one of the things you're going to want to think about initially. And maybe you've already started talking about it in the initial discussions you've had, but that's going to be something to give some thought to initially. So I think this is a pretty easy one, but in terms of the game of Uno, it is a card game. That is really the only playing pieces that you have in the game. So just a set of cards. There's no dice. There's no anything else. A lot of people don't know this. There is actually a scoring system for Uno. If you play competitive Uno that is played in rounds, there is actually a scoring system when you get to the end of a round for scoring it, but most people don't do that.
They added my daughter got one for Christmas at Uno game, and now it has a deck thing where you pull your card from this machine, and at any given time it could shoot out 10 cards or something crazy. It makes it miserable.
Interesting. Yeah, they try to update the oldies but goldies. You know, another game like that is Sorry. And if you've ever played the original Sorry, you basically just move your pieces around. You can send people back to home and so on. They've added 2 elements to the game. There's a fire ring and an ice ring. There's cards in the middle that you can pull every once in a while. And the fire ring lets you jump from one corner to the next corner on your turn. Just automatically move the piece to the next corner. So it basically shoots and if you're wearing the fire when you go into your home, you can pull one other of your pieces directly into the home. And the ice basically protects you. Nobody can kick you back to start if you're wearing the ice ring. What I've discovered, and there must have been a lot of modeling of this, it actually results in consistently close games. Adding those 2 elements. I remember playing Sorry and it would be a blowout. One person would have all their pieces in their home and everyone else still was getting their pieces out. And somehow adding those 2 elements to the game shuffled the game statistics enough that when we've played it, you pretty consistently at the end have most people have most of their players in home, and it's always a much closer game at the end.
So does that make it such that whatever effort you're putting into winning by some strategy is null and void, and it's really just a random event?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it obviously adds another layer of randomness to the gameplay because you don't know at any given time. You may have there's only one of each. So you may have the ice on and you're kind of playing knowing you've got, and then somebody gets the card that says they get the ice. And so suddenly you lose the ice and now you're vulnerable again. So you may have put yourself in a spot where now all of a sudden, or you're planning to keep that fire till you get in there and then somebody pulls it away. But I have noticed that it definitely evens out the end game of the game. Things are usually a lot closer.
I really like that.
I think it feels more competitive because it does tend to be closer at the end of the game than having one person blowing out the rest of the players.
I think kids lose interest after a while. It's always
if it takes, yeah.
Does
But
it
I don't know
make it
this.
a little bit longer?
No, it actually, if anything, I think it plays a little quicker because you do have that fire piece that does allow a token can basically make it all the way around the board in 4 turns. So it does speed that sort of stuff up. So, but I didn't know about the Uno game, the card spitter thing. I don't know.
That's when we play Uno.
Yeah. Oh, those games too. Like, do we have to play this for the 10,000th time? It's not very interesting. Anyways, all right. So moving on here. So then the next discussion should be about the competitive agents. How are you setting up? What are the competitive agents in your game? Is it a single player versus a single player, or is it 4 single players playing against each other? Is there a limit to how many players can play? Is it team-based? So do you have a group of players versus a group of players? Is it player or players versus the game rules, like solitaire? Um, and I should say, with each of these, there's no right answer. All of these are viable and all of them will work. You will need to decide in the context of your own game and who your audience is, which of these makes more sense. To look at player versus players, when you're player versus player, there's a lot more direct competition involved. And that might be a good thing for certain age groups, but it might not be a good thing for other age groups. If you have players in teams, that might sound better, but then you always run the risk of certain people in teams taking over and other people not really engaging in the game. I mean, it's like doing any small group activity in a classroom. So you'll just want to think about what makes the most sense in the context of your game, and then kind of build that in and make sure that the rules support that and that you're supporting that. So in terms of Uno, we are what? What's the
player versus player?
Yeah, player versus player. It could be versus player. I forget if Uno has a maximum number of players that can play at one time. We've got the official rules. I'll take a look at that.
I know I shouldn't kill this, but as far as keeping scores and how many cards are left in your opponent's hands afterwards, because you're out. So then is it like you stuck other people with like 15 cards?
Yeah, it's that sort of a thing. If when one player goes out, then the cards in other people's hands get tallied with a point system, and those points get awarded to the winner. So then if you're playing multiple rounds, it's not just I won 2 out of 3. You have to have the most number of points. So there's more strategy there. All right, so that's that. So now the next one, I mean, honestly, if we were doing a master's degree in gaming theory, this would be probably an entire semester's class about this. But I do want to bring into the mix just a couple of game theory, games construction concepts to think about. And one of them is informational style. So informational style for a game has to do with, what it boils down to is pick any player at any point in the game. Does that player know everything about the state of the game at that moment or not? As an example, chess is considered a perfect informational style because at any given moment, both players know the status of every piece in the game. There's no hidden information. You know what pieces are on the board, what pieces are off, you know where every piece is. So the amount of information that each player has at any given moment is perfect. They know everything. There's nothing unknown. An imperfect informational style is when there are hidden elements. When a given player does not know the location or the whatever of every piece. So for example, let's say like the game of, I don't know, Battleship. There we go. All right. So Battleship, you know the location of all of your ships, and you know which ones you've asked about. So you have some information, but at any given moment, you don't actually know where the other players' battleships are. All right.
So in a game like backgammon, where you can see all the pieces and you know all that information, but there's a dice roll coming, is that considered hidden information that you don't know the number coming up next?
It is a fine line. I think that is still more considered perfect.
Is it? Okay.
That's an unknown. It's a random chance thing, but you know the state of the game. You know where every piece is. So once that dice is rolled, both players know the full range of plays that could be played at that point. There's nothing hidden. If I'm playing Clue, I know my cards, and if I've been keeping track of what I've been asking other people, I know some bits of information about the rest, but I don't know what cards are in the little holder. I don't know what cards everybody else is holding. So that would be more of an imperfect thing. It's less about a random chance thing, but that's a good question. So that's going to be something to think about. And again, one is not better than the other. I think it's a little unfortunate they use perfect and imperfect because that makes perfect sound better than imperfect, but it's not. It's describing your knowledge of the game state. So obviously chess is a great game and it is a perfect informational style, but Clue is also a pretty darn good game and it's not perfect. It's imperfect. So, all right. So with that in mind, Uno would fall into which category? Imperfect. Yeah, and in fact, pretty much any card game is going to fall into the imperfect category because the whole point of a card game is that you don't know what everyone else is holding, you don't know what's in the stack, so you have to make your decisions based on.
So Monopoly is
certain
even
markets.
imperfect just because you don't know what's in the chance cards. That's close to perfect, but you don't, like, that's not a major part of it, but I guess there is some element of.
Yeah, I would actually put Monopoly closer to the perfect side of things. There's nothing ever really hidden. I mean, yeah, there's the stack of cards, but that's almost like the dice roll thing. Every player knows every property that everyone else owns at any given time. You know how many hotels or motels or houses are on each property. You can even basically see how much
player is
money.
holding any information.
Right. There's nothing in Monopoly. There's none of this. Like nobody knows that I own the utilities. You know, all of that's laid right out there where everyone can see what everyone else has.
What if your opponent doesn't know how much money you have?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think the way that they ask you to set the game up, you'll have a
I mean,
decent
you start
sense.
with the same amount.
Right.
And if you're keeping track, I suppose you could keep track of your opponent's money, but
Yeah, I mean, they ask you to you're supposed to tuck the money underneath your side of the board so people can kind of see roughly how
actually
much
say
you've
that.
got. What's that?
They actually say that you're not supposed to hide.
Yeah, I think there's a diagram of the game set up, and ideally, like your money basically gets banked under your side of the board, and then you lay your cards out for the properties you own. So I think it's designed to not be a hidden issue. So I mean, you could change the way the game is played by doing that. All right, then developmental style is the other one that is sort of the major consideration, and this has to do with, most games are based on turns, and this really boils down to, does the same set of rules apply or the same steps apply in a turn throughout the entire game, or does the game essentially evolve as the game goes along? So if it's a repetitive, and repetitive is definitely the far more common one, that just means that every round of the game, I mean, obviously the individual choices change and what happens may change, but the same set of rules, the same guidelines are applying every single turn of the game from start to finish. Progressive games would involve usually stages of the game where you get to a certain point and then kind of the rules of the game change, or a lot of role-playing style of games. Characters actually evolve and may take on different roles and have different abilities that then change the way the game actually works. So this is another thing to think about. I was trying to come up with a common progressive game, and I was thinking that like the game of life is kind of progressive. It's not as progressive as a game could get, but if you've ever played the game of life, the first chunk of the game, you're kind of focused on one types of activities. You haven't figured out your career yet or your salary, and so you're kind of going around and doing one set of things. And then there's the bulk of the board where it is kind of repetitive. You're going through things, but then you get across that bridge at the end, and the final chunk of the game, you're really focused on a different set of goals of, really trying to grab that last chunk of change that you can. You're cashing out things. You're, doing all of that. So that would be kind of a progressive sort of an idea where there's sort of three phases to the game, and your goals are kind of different in each of the three phases. So this will be just another thing to consider: is your game going to just literally be the same sort of thing happening round after round, or is something going to change as the game progresses through. Our game of Uno is a repetitive, yeah. And as I said, repetitive is definitely the most common, the more common of the two. I will say I'm not trying to turn any groups off of trying a progressive, but it definitely takes more planning and usually more rule development to do a progressive game because you're essentially building sort of multiple games that you have to work through. But give it some thought. All right, final two then, we're back to our definition, meaningfully ambiguous. You've got to make sure if these things are going to be games, then the question of are there meaningful ambiguous decisions being made has to be yes. If the answer is no, then you've either got a contest or a puzzle or something else. But for it to truly be a game, players need to be making decisions where the result of their decisions actually can change the outcome of the game, and that there's no one correct path that is known. If it's one correct answer, it's a puzzle. If we don't know if this is going to be the right choice or not, that becomes ambiguous, and that takes us into gaming. So make sure at its very core when you're talking about your games, what are those decisions going to be? And it can be the same decision over and over and over again, as long as when the player makes the decision that it can affect the outcome of the game and that they don't know that this decision is going to be better than that decision, that there's no one right path that has to be followed. So that's going to be something to think about in your design phase. In Uno, is there meaningful ambiguous decisions being made?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's basically what?
A number or a color.
Yeah, I mean, essentially selecting, you've got a selection of cards in your hand, picking which card to play. So sometimes you don't have much of a choice because the way the game has gotten to, you've only got one card you can play. Although there's a little used rule in the official rules of Uno that even if there's one card that you can play on a turn out of the cards in your hand, you are actually allowed to forfeit your turn if there's some strategic advantage to that. It is actually in the rules where you can decide. I was always told, no, if you can play a card, you have to play it. But there is actually something in the official rules that says that's not the case.
And then you don't have to draw either of that?
I think what you do in that case is draw one. I forget. I'll have to look, but there is basically a forfeit your turn rule where you can decide for whatever reason I want to hold on to this card. I don't want to play it right now. It's the only card I could play, so instead I'm gonna just draw one. So
no one would never know any differently anyhow. You'd have to be paying pretty close.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that's between you and the card gods. So. All right, so in your games, obviously in the design phase, what are those meaningful decisions going to be? What are they going to look like? And obviously our games, in order to be a game, has to have an end game state. So you've got to figure out what is the set of conditions that has to be reached in order for us to say that the game is done, and make sure that that's built into the rules. Is it when one person reaches a certain state? Is it when every player reaches a certain state? It can't just be, oh, sorry kids, end of the class, we ran out of time. That's the end of the game. You need to have something established that is going to let your players know when the game is done. So that's another design decision to make.
Can I ask a question about that? What about games that have like a timer? I'm trying to think of one. Would a timer be an end game? Like whatever you end with within a set amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the end game is typically used to determine who the winner is. So if it's a timer-based thing, the timer brings about the end game, but then you have to evaluate the state of the players at that point to determine the winner. So it's kind of a combination. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of, there's the games.
Boggle, where you get to make words.
Yeah, like Boggle, or there's the one where you push all the pieces down and you
Perfection.
set the timer,
That was, I couldn't think of that.
and you have to like pull. You have to get all the pieces, or you have to no. That one you have to put them in. Like
Perfection.
yeah, you have to get everything into all their shapes and everything before it pops, because then all the
But
pieces.
that's not
fly
really a
out.
game. There's no decisions.
Well,
It's a
there's
puzzle, right?
yeah, it's on the verge, because there is strategy of like what you try to look for specific pieces. Do you grab just the first piece your hand hits and then look for where it is on the board? I mean, there is a little bit of that. It does, that one is more of a skill sort of. I mean, that's where it's usually used, is to develop kids, manual dexterity.
Same thing even
and
with
getting,
Boggle, though. You're really not making any decisions. I think most of the time games are more like contests. 'Cause you're not-
yeah, that's true with Boggle. Because
You don't really.
that's more of a puzzle.
You're
You're
just
trying to
looking for-
identify patterns and just try to.
There's not one right answer. I mean, you can kind of say, oh, well, I'm gonna start from maybe the top and work to the bottom, or I'm just gonna play the whole thing. And it's not like,
Yeah, I mean, I guess there would be certain levels of strategy to Boggle. I think a lot of people go to Boggle and they just start randomly trying to chunk out as many words as they can find. Yeah, I mean, that would be a good discussion to take some of these games that are on the borderline and figure out whether we think they're games or not. All right, so anyway, so end game for Uno is, yeah, one player plays last card, and that's the end of the game. So everyone else who's left holding cards is left holding cards, and they're losers. All right, so Uno, having gone through this, it's a way to kind of verify that it is actually a game, because along the way we've checked that it's got competitive agents, we've checked that it's got meaningful ambiguous decisions, it's got an end game, and one would assume through all of this that there is a system of rules in place, which we know there is. So we know Uno, we can say for sure Uno is a game, and now we've got a little bit better idea of sort of the overall big picture of the game and what kind of a game it is, and so on. So looking ahead to next week, and actually I may as well pull this up right now so that we can have this out of the way, is in your groups over the next week, back on the Game Project Wiki, in each group's page, there is an ID page. And it is on this ID page that I've already given the framework to be filled in with the answers to various things. So there's all of the typical analysis questions. What are you trying to solve? What's the educational problem? What do you need? An instructional game that will, blah, 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 blah. Who is the game for? What are the learning outcomes? If there's standards you're addressing or anything like that. But then the second piece is the design phase, and this is basically exactly what we just went through with Uno. So what's the mode? What are the agents or the teams? What informational style, developmental style? What sort of game decisions, those meaningful decisions, learning outcomes, and the end game. The only new one in there that we didn't talk about with Uno was the learning outcomes, because Uno isn't really a educational game. But you're going to want to think a little bit, since you know what your educational goals are, you're going to want to think about how you're embedding those goals into the gameplay. So this is sort of the main piece of homework for next week for the groups, is to work through those first two parts of the ID plan. There's more after that as we get into the development. That comes down the road. Don't start worrying about flowcharting and developing the rules yet until you've had a chance to run your game idea past some people next week. All right, so I know we kind of zipped through that in some ways, but questions about any of that structure? You're probably already thinking about the ideas you've been talking about with your game and figuring out how some of this fits into it. So the other big piece, and this starts to go from the design phase into the development phase, is this idea of the flow chart. I can't guarantee that every game that's out there went through a flowcharting process in its development, but I would be really willing to guess that the overwhelming majority of them have. Because the flowchart, I think, is the best tool for really thinking through all of the things that can happen in your game and making sure that your rules have accounted for all of the possible situations. What you don't want to have happen is to have your students get into the middle of the game and somehow get themselves into a state in the game where the rules don't tell them what they're supposed to do next. On a flow chart, that would be a dead end. When we flow chart out a game, the goal should be that there are no dead ends with the exception of the end game. That should be the only thing that is a dead end. Everything else, every decision, every action should lead eventually back around to something else, with the exception of whatever gets you to the end game. So flow charting is really the best way to visualize this and to work it out and to move things around. A lot of times the flow chart and the rules kind of are developed side by side. So you come up with a rule and then you chart that out and see what that means in terms of the gameplay. Okay, they make this decision, so that splits into two possibilities. So what happens if they make this choice and what happens if they make this choice? And then you play that out. Or you're flow charting things out and you find those dead ends, then you've got to somehow bring something into your rules that keeps people from getting to that dead end or addresses what happens if they reach that dead end. So maybe you have to add a rule that says, if this happens, then next player has to whatever. So that is the kind of the rationale behind flowcharting and as how it's going to help as you start to develop the specifics of the rules of your game. So here's our activity for the evening, our arts and crafts moment. Yes, I've got the big pad of paper. Love the big pads of paper. I've got Post-its, stacks of Post-its. I've got a whole range of colored Sharpies to use. And the idea is, and actually I think this works out pretty well, and I'm actually going to ask that you work in your gaming groups, because as you're going through this, you may be having some little side discussions as you discover something about, oh, well, this might come up in our game or something like that. So we're going to break into two teams, and the idea is going to be to try to flow chart Uno as a game. If you are unfamiliar or you need a refresher, this is the actual official Mattel Uno rules. We're not going to worry, you don't have to flowchart the setup. You can put one box at the top of your chart that just says set up the game. So we don't have to go through and say deal every person 7 cards and set just say setup. But then from whatever the beginning of the game is, the beginning of gameplay, is going to be to try to figure out what happens, in what order, where do the decisions get made, where are there splits in the way that the game progresses. And I think this is a pretty obvious one, but obviously the game does something a little different if somebody plays a reverse card than if they play wild draw 4. So you're going to have sort of a branching structure of what are the different possibilities. So this section here of the special cards is probably going to come into play because that basically tells you what happens with each of those non-numbered cards. And then under that, I mean, the actual rules of the game are pretty short. I mean, here's the whole let's play section. That's essentially all of the just going through the game rules right there. There is then a little section about the end game and what happens at the end and what you need to make sure you've done. Scoring section, don't worry about the scoring. That, is something else. But that's what they call it, reneging. There is a reneging rule. You may choose not to play a playable card from your hand. If so, you must draw a card from the draw pile. If playable, that card can be played, but you may not play a card from your hand after the draw. So that is a sort of a special little rule. And then don't worry about the special rules for teams and multi-table and stuff like that. So we're basically just focusing on the typical game, 2 or 3 or 4 people sitting down and just playing one-on-one. So in terms of physically, and this is just a sort of a good habit to get into, using the Post-its in their square mode would cover something that is an action or something that happens in the game but doesn't have multiple outcomes. So if you've gotten to something and it's just saying, player must draw 4 cards, that would be this. If it's somewhere where a decision happens or a split happens, you simply turn the Post-it diamond shaped. And then usually what happens in flowcharts is you kind of come off of that diamond shape in different directions with connectors. So this would be, player picks a card. What card did they pick? And going out this way would be they chose a numbered card, they chose a draw 4 card, they chose a whatever. So we're going to kind of use that convention on these flowcharts of this is just something that happens, but really doesn't have multiple directions out of it. And this would be for anything where there's a split, either a decision is made or there's multiple directions that the game could go in. And I don't really want to explain much beyond that because part of this exercise is just to kind of discover what happens when you take a set of rules and try to backwards engineer it into the actual flow chart of gameplay.
Do you have the game?
What's that?
Do you have the game?
I didn't. I was thinking about whether I should throw in an actual game of Uno. I did not. But hopefully, at least with the rules available, I mean, I guess you could take some of these and quickly make them into cards if you wanted to have something to check out. But so that's the plan, and the expectation is not that we are going to complete the entire game. I think without giving too much away, one of the things you will probably discover is that even with a relatively simple looking set of rules like Uno, that a 5-year-old can master, the actual charting out of what happens and all the options that can happen can get a little more involved than maybe you think it would. So we'll get as far as we can. I will keep an eye on the time and make sure to cut us off in time that we can wrap up tonight with good time. But see what you can do, right? And I will circulate back and forth, and if there's a lot of angst, if you're in a team or if you're with people who are really, really detail oriented and really get frustrated about things not being perfect, set that aside a little bit and just be willing to kind of explore and let things be messy. So I've got 2 full stacks of Post-its here, so each group can take one of those stacks. Take whatever markers. You don't have to color code stuff. I had this thing of markers, so. But if you want to do a little bit, you might want to initially use pencil. I didn't bring pencils, but if you've got a pencil, sometimes using pencils initially to sketch things. The Post-its are nice because you can pull them off the paper and reposition them. So you may discover you get into it and go, oh, we actually have to make room for this, and then you can reposition things. And I also have a roll of tape. So in the past, sometimes one group has sometimes used that board back there and taped a piece of paper up on it. I actually last year had one group go out into the hall and tape a piece of paper up on the hall. Last night they just sat on the floor and worked on the floor. Wherever your group would like to go.
Is it not as hot in the hall? It
is warm in here, yeah. So maybe both groups want to go in the hall. That's totally fine with me. But rip off a piece of paper, grab some tape if you want it, grab a thing of Post-its, grab some markers. And like I said, the rules are here. I'll kind of leave this up on the board here, but if you've got a device that
in our teams for our game, or are we in different teams?
let's do our game teams, because that way you may, as you're going through this and struggling with getting a flowchart in place, you may, like I said, it may spark things about your own game ideas that would be useful to have those little conversations at that time to kind of start to keep an eye on these sorts of issues. All right, so supplies are here. Have at it. We'll do a half an hour maybe or so on this, so 8:30ish. Obviously, if you need to take a little break or something like that, feel free to do that as well. But see what you can do. Yeah, actually, the group last night discovered they had to tape 2 pieces of paper together because they. Well, no, they took up their initial organization kind of
just
filled up a
like-
page, and then they realized they had to keep going, and they, kind of so.
Yeah, sure, you don't wanna lay on the floor.
I'm so sure that my niece won't be able to tell me.
Yeah. Yeah, they were very relaxed last night. They were like all just kind of chilling.
It's probably like Mark said, it's probably a lot